Good morning. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center. Sorry, I keep saying that by default. It's 30 odd years of it. I am these days the executive chairman of the Center for Security Policy and have the privilege to be moderating a very important panel discussion about a book that is both extraordinary in terms of its content and in terms of its timeliness. It is entitled The Red Thread, A Search for Ideological Drivers Inside the Anti-Trump Conspiracy. Its author is our premier guest here, Diana West. She is also the author of two other terrific books, Death of the Grownup and American Betrayal. A longtime syndicated columnist, now a fellow with Epoch Times. She is also to be found at her splendid blog, DianaWest.net. To her immediate right is another extraordinary talent and ally in the fight I call the war for the free world, Chris Farrell. He is in charge of investigations at an extraordinarily important public policy organization, Judicial Watch. He has a background in the United States Army in counterintelligence. He is also, I think, a writer, columnist, or commentator for sure, and certainly a very prominent fixture at Fox News, among other places. We are thrilled to have him with us. To his immediate right is our final guest, Rich Higgins. Rich is a former explosive ordnance disposal member of the United States Army. He has served his country both in uniform and in senior ranks at the Defense Department in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, specializing in irregular warfare. He has gone on to serve for a time on the Trump National Security Council, and these days he is a senior fellow with Unconstrained Analytics. And also very welcome, distinguished colleague and great friend. To kick this off, we're going to ask Diana West to say a few words about this new book and the kinds of ideological drivers that she has uncovered behind the anti-Trump conspiracy. Diana West, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here. I'm very excited to be discussing the Red Thread today because, as Frank mentioned, it is extremely timely, this information, and I hope that it does begin to change our perceptions of the past 2 years of tracking and trying to understand this period of conspiracy and what many consider, and I do as well, a soft coup against the campaign and then the presidency of Donald Trump. What this book is about and why it is different from many of the books that have been coming out about these same events, very important books, those books tend to follow and unearth and illuminate the mechanics of this hoax. We have the Russia hoax by Greg Jarrett, for example, a fine book that goes through many of these steps. We have the work of Judicial Watch practically daily breaking important information related to this same opaque, hard to understand, behind-the-scenes federal attack on our election and then on the presidency. What I try to do in this book, and it's really in the subtitle, which is probably the most accurate of my subtitles of my previous books compared to them, a search for ideological drivers. In other words, why did these senior officials at Defense, at the Justice Department and the FBI, elsewhere in the Obama administration, across town, why did they decide to engage in what appear to be so many lawless acts to undermine an election and sabotage a presidency? In other words, we have a famous, wonderful system whereby the transition from one party to another every 2 to 4 years is peaceful. It's common for a revolving door essentially to function in Washington, whereby the out party does something else for a couple of years and waits to take political revenge next time. In this case, we've seen something so foreign to our understanding of how our democracy is supposed to work that I decided to try to find out if we could find out why it is that what we're looking at is so familiar to us from totalitarian systems. And that is a very serious undertaking, and it begins with the fusion GPS team of Nellie Orr and her husband at the Justice Department. This was sort of the beginning of the red thread. It looks at James Comey's ideological roots. It looks at John Brennan. It tries to build out ideological profiles that may help us understand why we have public servants who have sworn to uphold the Constitution who are actually operating under the very Marxist paradigm of the ends justify the means. And that would be sort of my
Let me just ask you
overview.
about one as an example of this ideological profile that you've done. James Comey, the director of
Yes.
Federal Bureau of Investigations, previously the number 2 man in the Department of Justice, it seems like an unlikely character given that personal record
Yes.
to have leftist or Marxist leanings.
Origins,
Walk
yes.
us through how you've discovered they're there.
Yes, well, he's very fine subject of study because he's been so open about his own philosophical influences on his entire career. When he was a senior at William & Mary, he graduated in 1982, he did a paper on the Christian in politics, and he looked at Jerry Falwell at the time, very important on the right, and he looked at the man who really is maybe considered his own ideological mentor, Reinhold Niebuhr. Most people don't know too much about Reinhold Niebuhr except that he is a liberal Protestant theologian. His writings, however, have shaped James Comey's outlook, not just as a student, but as recently as 2018, when the New York Times interviewed him on the occasion of him publishing his memoir, A Higher Loyalty, he was asked about the most important books that influenced his life, and he selected 2 Niebuhr titles from 1930-something and 1940, which is the period where Niebuhr was well known as a member of the Socialist Party in the United States and a very militant Marxist who in the early 30s was literally calling for the overthrow of the American social order. This is something quite staggering when you realize also that James Comey used his name Reinhold Niebuhr as his Twitter handle until he was discovered. This was when he was sort of incognito. Yes.
Right.
Yeah, so this becomes someone to really investigate, to look at the impact on James Comey's view of justice. And this is what he studied as a student when he considered himself to be a communist. He was very open about this in an interview Comey gave in 2003 with New York Magazine, where he talked about being a communist in college. He wasn't quite sure what he was now. This is what he told us as he was preparing to enter the Bush 43 administration as the number 2 at the Justice Department, but he had moved into a Republican style, you might say. It becomes very evident when you look at the kinds of things that he highlighted as a young man from Niebuhr's readings, and we can go into, I have some quotations, these have informed his behaviors that we have been trying to understand, whether it was with the Hillary Clinton, just complete cover up, and going forward with the triggering the special counsel investigation and so on, always against the rules, always against the Constitution. But when you understand that given his affinity with Niebuhr's view that it is up to the government to essentially redistribute what they call justice, this becomes evident that Comey sees himself as a servant of this notion of knowing better, doing better, and not obeying the constitutional precepts.
Yeah.
Order.
We're talking about the red thread with the author Diana West, and to have an appreciation of this profile and others that Diana has provided us of some of the central characters in this anti-Trump conspiracy. I'm very pleased to have Chris Farrell from Judicial Watch. Diana's paid tribute to your organization for having done so much of the heavy lifting in terms of exposing what we now know about this conspiracy. Chris, tell us what you make of this sort of appreciation of the motivations of some of those involved.
Well, thanks for having me here, Frank. I appreciate it very much. And congratulations to you, Diana, on an extraordinary work. You've done it again. American Betrayal, most recently, is a required reading by everyone in the country, in my opinion. It's probably the most important book in the last 25 years because it unveils, exposes an awful lot of what we'd rather forget. And so you've done it again. Now,
Thank you so much.
now the red thread, you've dared to ask why. No one asks why anymore. Everyone is asking what. Right? And so in the sort of the culture of whether it's the news media or whether it's the Twitterverse, everyone chasing the next bright, shiny object, everyone asks what. Very few people ask why. And you've asked why in a way here, and you've done the research and done the analysis that is we're starved of or starved from. It simply doesn't exist any other place. And your analysis with respect to the ideological drivers, we have this enormous scandal, not in the White House. There's scandals in the Department of Justice and the FBI. And we get a stream of facts or factoids, but no one says, well, why would someone do that? What's the motivation? What's driving it? What's the purpose? What's the cause? What's the goal? And the why that you ask is so important. And, in 100 and some odd pages of text, there's, per usual, Diana West style, there's 300 footnotes, right? So it's scrupulously documented. This is not, a 700-word opinion column that someone just throws out an idea. You've gone through and you've done the work and you've laid out the arguments and you've gone back to original source material and nailed each of the facts, which is absolutely critical because so much now is so superficial. Life is boiled down to a tweet. You don't do that. You really do the homework here, which is so important. You explore the ideology. You provide the context of history. You have quotes for attribution. Imagine that. And you commit the other great crime of the current period, which is that you don't forget. And that's a crime nowadays. You're supposed to forget, and you don't. So congratulations on a wonderful work. I think that the piece that in particular is exposed or revealed through your work, from my perspective, is it's a counterintelligence law enforcement question. And so my misspent youth was as a case officer running mostly counterespionage investigations, and then later on I was trained to be a clandestine human case officer. So the lens through which I look at all this is from an intelligence officer's perspective. And I know the mechanics of doing counterintelligence investigations. I've done them literally for a living, and I know what the requirements are. And when you look at the activities of the whole, Strzok or Page FBI National Security Division operation, you see them very craftily creating the conditions that allow them to open a counterintelligence investigation, which, by the way, is a criminal investigation, despite what everyone says. Oh, it wasn't a criminal investigation, it was a counterintelligence. National security crimes are crimes. Right? The 793F, which is the paragraph about mishandling national defense information, all the related paragraphs, are under Title 18. They are crimes. So people like to create this artificial, oh no, there's two different things. There isn't. But they contrived the scenario where they launched a counterintelligence event overseas in the UK, and this goes to some of the mechanics of how do you investigate and act against a campaign, a transition, and a presidency, and run penetration agents against those entities when there's a prohibition under the law from doing so. It's called undisclosed participation in U.S. organizations. You can get an attorney general letter that says, go ahead and do it. But do you think these guys are really going to rely on Loretta Lynch? I don't think so. So what you do is you manufacture a crisis, a counterintelligence event overseas, and it did so in the UK, whether it's Papadopoulos, Carter Page, etc., people like Steph Halper.
Right.
That's the pretext. And you go, oh my goodness, look, there's been this approach, this counterintelligence concern overseas. Then you import it back into the United States, and that gives you carte blanche to continue the investigation. If they had tried to do a penetration, to do this undisclosed participation, and penetrate a U.S. political campaign, this harkens back to 1968 Operation Garden Plot, where the FBI convinced the Army to penetrate Students for Democratic Society. There's still an emotional hangover in Army counterintelligence with respect to that, these many years later. So this is the technique, right? This is the manipulation and the abuse of counterintelligence activities under color of a criminal investigation as a means to go after political opponents. The parallel I want to draw for folks is that if you took the same caliber of persons, meaning the same rank, same authority, same GS scale, or same assistant secretary type title, and here's the thought experiment. Take DOJ and FBI officials of that rank and caliber that we know the litany of shame, the 24 names of persons, lift that up, slide it over, and drop it into the Defense Department. Those are flag officers, generals and admirals, senior field grade officers, senior civilians, same parallel, and that would be a coup. Well, this is a legal coup.
Legal coup.
This is lawfare.
Yeah.
We don't have tanks in the street, but we have very senior law enforcement officials at DOJ and FBI manipulating the levers of law enforcement and intelligence activities for the express purpose of undermining the President of the United States. It is probably the gravest political crisis constitutionally we have ever faced. This makes Watergate look like Keystone Cops. And your book has gone a long way to explain why.
Right.
The question no one else asks.
We're talking about this book, the latest from Diana West, The Red Thread, the search for ideological drivers inside the anti-Trump conspiracy. Diana, you have nicely teed up the purpose of the book as discerning why people involved in this anti-Trump conspiracy, many of whom have been identified through the great work of Chris Farrell and his team at Judicial Watch, would do a legal coup, as you call it, and I don't know that that's quite the right term. It would be illegal to do this, but it's using legal mechanisms to effect what might otherwise be a military-style coup. Chris has helpfully explicated why this is so important to get at these ideological roots for such a grave crisis, a constitutional crisis of the first order. You've indeed suggested that it makes Watergate look like Keystone Cops. To helpfully address both the history and the ideological implications of this coup, and to explain how this bears on our ability to perform the sort of counterintelligence work that is needed to protect our country against such activities. I couldn't be more pleased to have Rich Higgins with us.
Thanks,
Rich,
Frank.
you bring a lot of background to all of these topics. Take it from there.
Thanks, Frank. I think, Diana, I just have to say thanks. I mean, as somebody who operates regularly inside this community, it's refreshing to have a breadth of, factual information, sweep into the system because, for so long now, the United States has been caught up in a PC malaise, this politically correct malaise that drives and conditions us to move away from reason and move away from critical thinking. And I think, substantiating, some of your questions and then others, I think that the thing I take away from the book, and you say this towards the end of the book, is we need to do more work inside this area, right? And I think I'll talk about three real takeaways I had from the book, which was, the history of ideological warfare, right? And tradecraft, and then how the history and the tradecraft inform information age, I'll call it information age ideological warfare, which component is the use of legal means in an unconstitutional way. Lincoln famously said, and I think the Civil War was probably the closest constitutional crisis that we've had to this. Lincoln famously saying, I think it was maybe at the Douglas speech, if we first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could best judge what to do and how to do it. And I think we're at that point of reflection. And I think it's really important that we move this away from a partisan political discussion. This is not a partisan political discussion. This is, do we continue to exist as a republic under the Constitution? That's how important this is. And if we move past this with no prosecutions and nobody going to prison for this, I think we have officially then entered the post-constitutional era, and I don't know if we'll ever recover it. Some of the things that I really walked away thinking, most Americans, this includes, and you can attest to this, Chris, this includes people in the national security community, perhaps even more so than the civilians, is there is a dearth, an absence, a vacuum of knowledge regarding the history of Marxism and socialism, going all the way back to the Hegelian dialectic and up to how that informs, you mentioned Students for Democratic Society. I would argue that probably 95% of the people in today's intelligence community are not familiar with that history of American intelligence, that history. I think, back during the Trump campaign, I watched as veterans, and veterans flocked to President Trump. And I think, Diana, you do a credit to yourself in the book, because yours is the first book I've seen that I think accurately reflects the counter-revolutionary nature of Trump's election itself, which was a rejection of this postmodernist, Marxist, cultural revolution that's been taking place. And, I think it's important that looking back at this, maybe 50, 100 years from now, we understand the context within which this was taking place. And to do that analysis in a purely partisan way misses the nature of Trump's election. Your book is the first one I've seen, I think, captures that effectively and does much to explain why these individuals that we mentioned, Comey, Brennan, you can go all the way to President Obama himself, and their Marxist influences really drove the behavior that surrounded this coup. In terms of tradecraft, I think the thing I take away from this is most Americans think of tradecraft as spying, stealing of secrets. But the purpose of intelligence operations is the influence on the deliberate decision-making process of your adversary, whether that be to blind him or to inhibit his policy solution set, or to perhaps drive him into actions inimical to his own interest. And I think your book accurately captures that it's a far more insidious and subtle threat than most people think. The glory of the guy stealing the suitcase, well, that's a bunch of nonsense. This book is, I think, one of the best spy, intelligence, influence warfare books that's been written, period, if you want to understand it. And then I think, and I don't want to go all day, so I'll speed it up a little bit. It's amazing to me that for a country, the United States, founded on an idea, we don't understand ideological warfare, right? Going back to the Sons of Liberty meeting at the Green Dragon Tavern in Boston, and the confluence of events that allowed the United States to even be formed, which was similar to today. Back then, they had the printing press. And the printing press allowed Thomas Paine's common sense to promulgate across the continent. And the same with the advent of the Pony Express, which for the first time allowed events in Boston to be shared quickly with people around the country. Back then, of course, it was days and weeks, not seconds in the Twitterverse. But similar, I think we're in that same sort of information age revolutionary period here, and where ideological warfare is now more important. And none more so, though, beyond the domestic side of the security threat that's related to this. As people are reading this, they need to be asking themselves, where are the Russian influence? Yeah, sure, right? I mean, you talk about that in the book, and who was really working with the Russians. But where are the Chinese in this game? As the most fascist, totalitarian, communist country that has ever existed, makes the Soviet Union look small by comparison in terms of their actual militancy and the mechanisms by which they now have enforced to place it. I can't say enough about the takeaways from the book. And in fact, I think I'm still kind of processing it, because it's one of those books that you read and you have to keep revisiting and going back to it. The final takeaway from it is, I talked to a lot of the older guys, I'll put in quotes, right? The 70 plus guys who fought the Cold War. And, I've shared some of what you wrote with them, and they are just struck, by the comparisons, going back to 1930s and the 1950s, which you touch upon in your other great book, which I agree with Chris. It should be required reading. It is one of the most important, probably the most important national security book written in the past 25 years, maybe ever. Because the future of warfare, this, as somebody who studies war, the future of warfare is going to look a lot more like what we're seeing today than people would like to believe. It is economic, it is legal, it is information. And the Chinese are telling us this. The Russians are telling us this. So, timely book, can't say enough about it.
Rich, thanks so much. Each of you have talked a little bit about this, but I think it's worth doing a quick review. It's not an accident, comrade, as they used to say in the Soviet Union, that we don't understand the history of ideological warfare. It's not that it's too hard to fathom. It's that we've been actively discouraged, if not punished, for doing so. Would you just talk a little bit about that, Diana? And again, this goes over to some of the work that you did do in like second, third, whatever it is, the compliments on American Betrayal. But it features prominently in this too. The willful blindness and the punishing of those who actually perceive it and talk about it as you have.
Well, thank you all for your comments and your compliments. This kind of research, the research of American Betrayal, which is a much, much longer book and took several years to produce, is actually really the prerequisite for having embarked on this particular study. And it is a work in progress. It's the beginning, really. But what knits it together with American Betrayal and really this whole subject is the thread of continuity to the past, to the Marxist assault on this nation, which we can look at in terms of certainly a century. Earlier, yes, and there are many important strands, but in terms of once the Soviet Union existed, we can sort of take a hard time frame from that period forward, watching as agents of influence, fellow travelers, and dupes embarked on this project to take us down. And at the same time, there were great patriots and concerned American citizens and constitutional protectors who entered public life as journalists and politicians and citizens involved in different groups who met this challenge. And part of the warfare, which I think we're now really subject to, was to destroy them. And this goes back to the very earliest examinations of communism in our country in New York in 1920 or so with the Lusk Committee in New York State. I mean, this would be probably the first really signal investigation of communist propaganda. We later see the 1930 Hamilton Fish of New York starting investigations into communist propaganda and subversion, mostly at this point by foreigners into our system through Congress, the United States Congress. We see a very interesting point that I'd like to make. In the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact, there was this window where you could be anti-Soviet and anti-communist in public life because of the pact between Stalin and Hitler. So it was all right. And in New York State, again, which as the gateway for most immigration and most communist immigration, this is the first state really that was dealing with this problem. You had an investigation of the New York State, of the New York City schools and colleges, the public schools and colleges, in that 1940-41 period. And it was already a case that the school system, the education, the college system, CCNY, and the other public universities, which are a credit to the state, however, they were completely saturated with communists in terms of instructors, organizations, cells, and so on. So this is how deep it was.
Institutions
was well underway, even before. Yes.
Wow.
So the people who were trying to deal with this, you see in the late 1930s, you see Democratic representative from Texas, Martin Dies, opening up a committee that became known as the House Un-American Activities Committee to investigate something we don't even imagine exists as a culture anymore, as a society anymore, un-American activities. Is there such a thing today?
Inside the United States.
Inside the United States. Propaganda, subversion, and how Congress might address, these were investigations, these were not trials. These were investigations to amass information to see if Congress could craft laws to protect the Constitution and our way of life. the demonization of chairmen such as Dies, and many of these chairmen were actually, given the political shape of the country, were Democrats. I mean, you see a lot of Democratic chairmen in the House investigation committees and the Senate, climaxing with everybody knows who Senator Joseph McCarthy was, who was for a very short time the chairman of an investigating committee in the Senate in the 1953-1954, very short time, became the devil demon dog of American history at that point for having been so terribly successful at exposing communists and Soviet agents inside the federal government. This is what he was concerned about, inside the Pentagon, inside defense-related, more than the Pentagon, defense-related organizations, research labs, etc.
And the key piece of this, of course, is that he has been vindicated
Well, he has been vindicated,
in history,
but
and yet still vilified.
Vilified as a means of controlling everyone else who wants to investigate the impact of Marxism on the destruction of our Constitution and our way of life. That becomes very important to understand, that actually McCarthyism as a tool, as an information weapon of war, was actually promulgated by the Communist Party of the United States with input from Stalin himself through the various communist organs of the day. So this
It's a very high priority at the time.
very high priority, and everyone who mouthed it, and that would include the entire, that would go right on up to President Trump himself, not just the left, the right. Everyone who continues to inveigh against McCarthyism is essentially playing right into that same communist information operation.
This brings me back to sort of the practical implications of this, and both of you, Rich and Chris, have talked about it, but maybe just amplify on it. As people who have spent time both thinking about and actually practicing counterintelligence, what are the implications of this McCarthyism takedown? And the fact that, as Diana said very, I think, accurately, it's now unimaginable that we could have subversives operating inside the United States for the purpose of taking us down. Chris?
Let me launch the preemptive strike on the critics who undoubtedly will suddenly come out and begin attacking the red thread. And
I hope so.
I do too.
Whether you hope so or not, it will happen.
In their own inimitable style, so they'll go after Diana personally as well. So let me launch the preemptive strike and tell you that one of the critical techniques used to sensationalize, trivialize, controversialize, marginalize, every effort made to diminish or in some way ridicule what's an incredibly important piece of work will be dragged out. All the techniques and tools.
Yeah.
And so they'll say, can you believe that these people got together to talk about communist influence? Hey, it's 2019. Welcome back from the Cold War, right? All this sort of snide, snarky, condescending language will be used in an attempt to say, well, don't even read it. Don't bother. We'll, carefully homogenize it for you, and we'll tell you what you need to know about this. And this is one of the oldest techniques and tactics in the world, the effort to marginalize and trivialize something by being oh so sophisticated and oh so much part of the establishment.
Don't deflect.
Correct.
Issues.
And so don't fall for it, don't buy it. Buy the book instead, read the book, because this will create, I virtually guarantee, this will create its own little Twitter storm and all the usual remarks from all the usual characters on the left, because they are terrified of the analysis that Diana has done. They are absolutely terrified, because what they want the American public to believe is that, hey, look, the Cold War ended, let's say 91. That's a good number to pick. And, we're just looking ahead at progressive ideas and causes. And heaven forfend, you take historical facts, documentation, conduct, behavior, and drag it into perspective against the history, which is what Diana has done here. And that exposes and reveals people for who and what they are, and what their activities are. You're free to think and believe whatever you want, have fun. But when you start using the levers of government and the authority and power of both law enforcement and the intelligence world, and you have your hands on the controls of those things, and you engage them to flip an election, that's something very different. You're free to believe and practice and have at it. But when you use your official position in an orchestrated, deliberate campaign with others to try to flip an election, that's something very different.
It's called criminal activity, I think, to put a fine point.
Yeah, I mean, and that's really the difference.
Again, we're talking about the red thread, a search for ideological drivers in the anti-Trump conspiracy, a book by Diana West, and very pleased to say published by the Center for Security Policy Press. And Rich, to you, you've probably done more serious work than anybody I know, along with Steve Coughlin and perhaps a few others, on the character of the ideological warfare that is so much in evidence at the moment, quite apart from this specific conspiracy, but the context in which this is operating against the Trump presidency. Chris sort of alluded to the new upsurge in interest in socialism and the sort of fashionable notion that, well, this isn't really the horrible thing that we've seen in the past in the Soviet Union or in communist China or even today in Venezuela. Give us a sort of the straight dope on who are the champions of this ideological warfare in our time, and how is it that they're getting away with as much traction given the horrible record of Marxism and socialism and communism in the past?
They just didn't get it right last time, Frank. They just missed it a little bit. One more chance.
One more time.
I think it's really important that we understand, and you alluded to this earlier, Frank, which is where we are in terms of our capacity to conduct ideological warfare is the intended outcome of a hostile campaign that's been underway for, at the anniversary of, you go back to 1917, remember 102 years almost, okay? I think, the simplest way to explain it for the audience would be the way Bezmenov did, and then the way we do influence ourselves. And I'll start with the way we do it. There are four principal target sets when you're attempting to influence a country or a culture or a group. You go after their students and youth. You go after their labor groups, organized labor groups. You go after their media. And most important, you go after their elites. And the mechanisms by which you do that, they're manifest. But the ones that really pop to mind, and I think you see it every day, and the parents out there fighting the cultural fight see it every day, are the schools. Okay? And the schools are so important, and we've completely neglected the role education plays in national security. And we've neglected it for a long time. I'd say second would be the media, and then I'm going to break that up into two areas. So to call it the traditional media, and we know the issues we have with the media right now. Fake news is propaganda. I mean, it's important that we use the term. It is propaganda. Russia hacked the election. Russia hacked the election. I don't know how many times each of us heard that in the past couple of years, but it is truly mind-boggling. But I want to really,
because the evidence is not there to support.
Correct. A complete fabrication, and then a concoction, if you will, right? And then the thing that I think, the second part of that is today's new age media and social media, and we see now the gate is closing on social media, which was the only thing that really allowed Trump to retain his political momentum after the primary, where he kind of slipped through the primary where the media kind of built him up. I think they thought he'd be a bowling pin that Hillary Clinton could knock over, and then he turned out, because of social media, because of the grassroots mobilization in the counter-revolution, to carry it forward. So those are kind of the mechanisms by which I think we need to see how the influence is rolling out. And I think it's really important to understand on a wider scale, and I mentioned Yuri Bezmenov earlier, for people who haven't researched him, and Diana talks about him, in several different pieces. I don't recall if he's in this one exactly, okay, but I know he is in American Betrayal. For those of you who haven't seen any of his videos or his interviews, please go back and look at them. But he talks about the 4 phases of a societal level takedown. He talks about demoralization, destabilization, crisis, and response. Demoralization being defined as the point at which you're unable to discern the truth. And I think that's where we are. We are dislocated from reality. We're in a post-fact environment. And Diana, with her book, has made an attempt to give you some facts and to provide for you a starting point where you can take what she says here and you can go out, and I think Diana, please go out and investigate it for yourself. You don't believe what she's saying, go out and investigate it for yourself. We're now, I believe, in a late phase destabilization, and we need to take into account the seriousness of this situation. And I'm concerned by the fact that amongst the people that you'd think would take this very seriously, there is still a kind of a benevolent dissociation going on. There's a lack of true strategic insight from, I'll call them, our societal elders. The veterans, the Cold War fighters, past presidents who have elected not to speak out on this. And I think it's time for them to step up and take a position on this because, again, I agree with Chris. This is the most serious constitutional crisis, in my personal opinion, since the Civil War. That's where we're at.
I'd like to add some or ask something of all of you gentlemen. When you look at what is presented here, and we've all agreed that we're seeing these Marxist drivers and we're seeing a common thread among the people who are involved in this conspiracy against President Trump. What I continue to work over and mull is really the question going back to who benefits and how is this benefiting? And I would like to really know what you think about this, because if we go back to the whole construction of the narrative against Trump and really the underlying basis of all the investigations, it is that Putin wanted Trump to win. Putin hated Hillary. Now, I know we've talked about this many times in terms of how that makes no sense given Hillary Clinton's, given the Clintons' decades of public service, if we call it that, but in terms of their relations with Communist China, the Obama administration's various good works for Russia until there was a switch. That to me struck me as...
Including Hillary specifically.
Including Hillary very
specifically. Just say one
specifically.
quick word on Skolkovo, if you
will. Well, yes, Hillary was very front and center as Secretary of State in the construction of this, really the most remarkable high-tech transfer, the neatest, seriously sensitive high-tech transfer of Western technology, a lot of it being American, to Russia with the construction in concert with the Russian government of basically a Silicon Valley outside of Moscow, known as Skolkovo. This was the centerpiece of the reset, and it's gone
benefiting, among others, Hillary Clinton Foundation
with
donors.
Yes, of course, we see a tremendous proportion of the donors, the Cisco Systems and others who were involved in this and also involved in the foundation, very similar to what we saw with the Uranium One transfer with the donors from the board into the Clinton Foundation, and
a
all
counterintelligence problem of the
yes.
first order.
Well, it was, and the Army actually brought it up in an open report in around 2013, very concerned specifically about the transfer of hypersonic missile engine technology that they were concerned was going, which seems to have gone because we've seen...
Gone and is now pointed at us.
It's now pointed at us. So with all of that, the question becomes, when Comey, this was Comey, who established the notion in testimony that Putin hated Hillary, loved Trump. But when we look at the machinations, when we look at what's going on with this administration in terms of undermining it, who is benefiting with what's going on? And so I'd be interested in what foreign state actors benefit from what this conspiracy has wrought.
Chris, could I just add, to tack on to that, as you answer it, you guys at Judicial Watch have done unbelievably important work, not only in exposing the anti-Trump conspiracy, but the covering up of the Hillary Clinton criminal activity and her entourage. So Cui bono, I guess, is the Latin
Yeah.
term for who benefits.
Yeah.
Cover that if you would.
I think interestingly, we've now documented, and we have, at this point, thousands of pages of material, all of which is on our website. So if you don't believe me, go read the documents yourself. You make the decision. But we have instances where well, not even instances, we have a course of conduct where there is no daylight whatsoever between Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, and the Clinton Foundation. And it's documented repeatedly in emails. For example, Huma Abedin, who acting as Hillary's personal assistant for 20 years, there's emails to and through and back and forth with her about foreign organizations, foreign government leaders, seeking access to the secretary. And there's one, a Bahraini prince, who says, in fact, the comment is, the normal channels didn't work. We need you to get a meeting for him. And she responds back, okay, we'll set something up. So, I mean, it's an explicit acknowledgement.
And she actually was part of the campaign.
Correct. And
part of the State Department, part of several other consultants, but also part of the foundation.
Correct.
This middle person.
And then there's additional emails, not just explicitly saying, look, the normal process, meaning someone approached State Department either through an embassy or through some, assistant secretary, the routine measures, they asked for a meeting, they said, we'll consider it, they were told no. That had collapsed the legitimate way. There should be interface. I'm not knocking foreign contact. It should happen.
Probably not an accident that it collapsed, don't you think?
Right. And so, and when that does happen, you have Doug Band, Clinton Foundation official, using the back channel. And he even notes, yeah, he's a big donor. I mean, it is so explicit, so blatant that they're using this channel as an unauthorized way or unconventional way of establishing this contact, seeking a favor, money involved. It is literally pay to play.
Russians included.
Correct. And again, there's pages and pages of this material. When Mrs. Clinton leaves the State Department and the Inspector General, we all know what Inspectors General are, right? There's the Department of Cover-Ups, where the truth goes to die. When the Inspector General of the State Department goes to conduct an investigation into these matters, she refuses to cooperate. How much yelling and screaming was there about the former secretary telling the Inspector General drop dead?
As I recall, she didn't allow there to be a proper Inspector General. There was an acting
Correct.
one
Correct.
who was much more susceptible, apparently, to her kind of stuff.
Correct. And then in the end, she told them, go away, and they all...
And she got pretty much the same treatment from Comey and Strzok and company as
Correct.
well. Right?
I mean, it's...
So, Rich, cui bono? The question occurs. As you see it, was it the case that Putin wanted Trump, or would it make much more sense for him to want Hillary? And what does the record show in terms of his efforts to get her rather than him?
I think that we spend a lot of time talking about Russia as it pertains to this series of incidents, but I think that the main benefactor in all this is going to turn out to be China. Right? Well, the strategy 101, day one, lesson one, bullet one: don't ever take two adversaries and put them into an alliance against you. And that is what we are doing. We are driving Russia into the hands of China. Our military is good, but do we really need that convergence? The technological sharing, their proximity to one another, the Shanghai Cooperative Organization, and now we now see the gas lines that we're trying to move out of Europe are going to be heading towards China. There's a tremendous lack of strategic insight in understanding how a weakened presidency will hurt the country in the long term. Right. I think in terms of other actors you can name all of our enemies, right? Who benefits from having a weakened president? All of them. Iran. Not even run down the list. North Korea. I'm not sure that was the driver behind what Comey and all those guys do. It's a derivative. It's a derivative effect. But again, it just goes to show that. The corruption that surrounded the Clinton machine has been A, seen by our adversaries and our enemies, and B, weaponized. And C, now, well, it's the old thing growing up in Boston. I remember my father telling me as a young man, when the gangsters would come around, never do a favor for them and never have them do a favor for you, because once you're corrupted, you're permanently corrupted. So even if Hillary Clinton wanted to extract herself from this now, she can't. So we get these desperate political plays that come out. Getting back to a rule of law is a strategic imperative, the likes of which I don't know if this country has ever faced, and I don't know the mechanism, absent the Attorney General stepping up, and candidly the President himself, to reclaim it. The American people are waiting.
We're probably about the end of our time. I'd like to just get each of you to do a sort of closing summary, both about, again, the Red Thread, the book that we're here to talk about, Diana West's newest but also about what we should be doing on the basis of this kind of information to try to assure the survival of our republic. And Diana, I know there's a great number of other characters here. You mentioned John Brennan. You alluded to, you passing mention of John Brennan. Nellie Orr was another one. We can't do justice to any of these others, but I did want to just invite you to close with a sort of broadening of the lens, as well as prognosis for what we need to do next.
Yes, well, I think that I was not expecting when I was going through this exercise was to find so many connections among these people. There are family connections, there are multi-generational connections, there's continuity with essentially the people back in, say, the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s trying to shut down investigations into un-American activities, who are the mentors or the inspirations of the characters who are now in this conspiracy. This, to me, becomes a very important effort to open it up and understand no Russian influence, Chinese influence, other kinds of communist influence or adversarial influence does not start in 2016. And the importance of trying to break through the fear that we have as a society, as a political class, as a journalistic class group, to actually dare to make these connections and try to see what the implications really are. And I think it sounds like a very elementary step, but it is illuminating, because once you start to make them, you do start to see how these networks have been weaponized. And certainly what is strange, but a true thing, is looking at the Clinton organization, not just in the Hillary Clinton years of power, but going back to the rise of Bill Clinton. So many of those players from Arkansas days and Washington days, going back to the 90s and earlier,
To Oxford.
Yes, are players today in the whole Steele dossier conspiracy and the whole operation. And that is truly, we didn't get a chance to touch on that, but that is truly illuminating. Again, getting to the idea of networks, families, generations, all engaged in this counter-constitutional assault.
Yeah, cool. Chris, you mentioned sort of preemptive responses to criticisms. One, of course, will be that this is all just evidence of more conspiracy theory. Talk us through, if you would quickly, the difference between conspiracies, for which there is ample evidence, and conspiracy theories, which typically are unfounded, or may not be. Though I will say that our friend, I think of all of us, Andy McCarthy used to say, back when he was an assistant assistant U.S. attorney in the Southern District of New York, that under Rudy Giuliani there was an old adage that they followed, which is every conspiracy begins with a conspiracy theory. Your insights from your collective experience on this, plus closing comments about Dinah's book.
Well, documentation is key, right? So people can come up with all sorts of ideas and notions and, rumors, etc. What Diana has done here, and what she's done in American Betrayal and carries it through now, is that there's 300 footnotes. So she cites to people's own work, what they've written, what they've said, source material, primary source material that's irrefutable. And so people that just want to wave their arms and say, oh well, that's something out of the 1950s, or go and read it, see what it says, see what these people advance. I believe that when someone's taken the time to publish something and they have all sorts of research or documentation to it, when you read the original material, they actually meant what they said. So it's important to read what the opposition, what they say their principles are. The notion that somehow the themes and the activities discussed in this book are quaint, or are something from a bygone era, or are, oh, we're done with that, come on, this is 2019.
Or
We've had
cherry-picking facts to try to make some sort of conspiracy where there isn't actually.
The contemporary culture has had a mind wipe, right? They don't know or even comprehend the not-so-distant past, the history that we've been through. It's as though that, okay, there was this hard break and now we have this new chapter. And that's why President Trump is so threatening to these people, because he's such a disruptor. The establishment, I don't care if you have an R or a D after your name, the big capital E establishment, they had a narrative, they had a system, they had, this sort of nickel's worth of difference shift in policy about how they saw the America unfolding. And here comes this guy who completely upsets the apple cart, brings in this notion of, hey, how about America first? How about we not worry about the whole globe? How about we worry about this country first? We're going to advance our interests. We'll still engage. We'll still have trade. We'll still be friendly. We'll still have alliances. But we're going to worry about ourselves first. This is enormously disruptive to all the conventions of how we're supposed to operate. And so when they see this threat, everything is unloaded to stop the disruptor. And that's that. And Diana's book explains to you why they did that.
I wanted, Rich, ask you just in closing to talk a little bit about the specific threat that this disruptor represented to the ideological impulses of this globalist New World Order, whatever elite you want to describe it as, establishment. And specifically, again, what do we do about this, knowing what we now know thanks to Diana?
Well, I know we're here talking about the Red Thread today, and everybody out there should read it. I think it's important that I read this having already read American Betrayal, and it presents a much more comprehensive picture. So I would encourage people, as you read this, go back, then pick up American Betrayal, read that, and then come back and revisit this, because I think you'll see that there are historical ties that pull you across a time to understanding this. When I think about the book, Diana, I really I'm struck by a couple of things that we need to have happen. Okay, and this is not avoiding a question, Frank, but I think it's important that this get out there. One is education is a national security issue. Okay, we've talked about the border being a national security, and immigration. Education is a national security issue. Two is national security community must reemphasize ideological warfare. All right, there are no robust programs by which we teach intelligence officers this stuff. The intelligence programs that do exist today are often shaped by another hostile counterintelligence program, this Countering Violent Extremism program, which I know the Center for Security Policy has been talking about for years. It is a counterintelligence program. Again, the enemy's effort to control our understanding of our enemy, right? And then revitalizing the counterintelligence community, and I think, Chris, you have more expertise in this area. Revitalizing counterintelligence, and a personal concern of mine is the Defense Department during the Obama administration kicked the role of counterintelligence out to the combatant commands and the services for them to handle. So there is no real consolidated, coordinated effort going on at the strategic policy level, coordinated with the intelligence community writ large, that deals with these threats and can shape-shift and adjust to the events as they unfold. And I think, when I look at when I look at the book, and I think this is what really strikes me is Diana can say what she says, and they're going to label all of us at this table as conspiracy theorists. But remember, that's just the thought-terminating cliche. The only reason they do that is because they don't want you to listen to us. Listen to us, then go read it for yourselves. Because what Diana has here is you see James Comey in his own words explaining his understanding of justice, which is a post-American understanding of justice. You see John Brennan in his own words. And I think the linchpin to all of this, and unfortunately she's kind of hidden, from testifying because of the spousal privilege, etc., is Nellie Orr. Nellie Orr really jumps out from the pages of this book to me. And not the least of which is because I remember back in the 80s as a young man reading books about the Soviet Union, and one of the ways they communicated was a system called one-way voice link, which was singular pathway transmissions used in ham radio systems. And Nellie Orr uses that communication system. These things just jump out at me. And I think the last statement I was like, if you want to know what 2 + 2 equals, it doesn't equal 5, read Diana's book.
Here it is. The Red Thread, a search for ideological drivers in the anti-Trump conspiracy. It's available at Amazon. You can also get the Kindle version. It is a tribute to Diana and the work that she's put into this, that not only have you heard such accolades, but you've heard them from some of the best in the business. And it's a privilege to have them here. Rich Higgins, Chris Farrell, as well as, of course, the author Diana West. Thank you for an extraordinarily illuminating conversation. And I second, third, fourth, and fifth the idea that this is one of the Rosetta Stones that needs to be taken aboard by every American concerned about what's happening to our country and what we had best be doing to save it. Thank you very much for joining us again. This is Frank Gaffney with the Center for Security Policy. We appreciate your time today.